Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and on today's episode of Early Access Reviews, we are going to be taking a look at the brand new Wind 5-star Evolution Sub-DPS Anaxa himself. I'm just going to jump straight into the kit, and the summary is going to be his a skill point positive, 7 weakness implant, insane ultimate spam, bounce plus AoE targeting, which means that Anaxa is pretty much the perfect example of a Sub-DPS for, at this point of time, the Herta, right? Making considerable upgrades to the 4-star counterparts, especially if you do not have Jade or even E1 Jade. While not really the most optimal team, he is also capable of pivoting as a main DPS himself, which I found surprisingly fun and satisfying to play. Right? So in summary, Herta players looking for a direct vertical investments, especially for those that missed out on Tribi, they will find excellent value with Anaxa. So jumping straight into the character kit, he mainly shines with his 30 energy basic plus free skill follow-up. But note that this follow-up skill is not really a follow-up attack, right? So you're not going to be gaining benefit from Solo 2-piece or even Duran. It is essentially just triggering an extra skill, like a whole ass skill by itself, which means you can in fact get the 30 energy from this extra skill. So after, if you take a look into his traces, he would be guaranteed 60 energy every single time when he does his turn, and if you get there with an ER rope, that is going to be guaranteed a 2-turn ultimate, right? So after the ultimate, which is going to be guaranteed at first action every single time, this can help the Herta as well as even Tribi or even Robin drive extremely fast in terms of energy uptime, while supplementing the Herta's potential weakness against single target environments in the future due to his skills bounce targeting, right? The weakness implant itself creates a very nice flexibility, but it is especially useful in, for example, Apocalyptic Shadows, where the main mechanic is breaking the toughness bar as soon as possible. Note that at this current time, I do feel that Anaxa is extremely accessible at even E0, S0, with much lesser reliance for his S1 compared to the other version 3 units that we have seen so far. So for his basic attack, because he has the same traits as Sparkle, you'll find quite a lot of time that you will be using his basic attack, especially as a sub-DPS, in order to funnel skill points to the rest of the team. So for example, the Herta using your skill points, Tribi using a skill to generate the ultimate a little bit faster, or even Gallagher or Lingsha to use their skill points respectively, right? Especially if your D Herta is at E0, S0. Going into the skill, this is essentially Dr. Ratio's follow-up attack, but it's basically on steroids, right? This is going to be Anaxa's main source of damage as well as energy, and you will be seeing this in combat extremely frequently. 350% multiplier on a single target when you combine everything into one is pretty decent as a standalone, but since most content currently does involve around mobs, it will diminish the damage towards the main target, right? But the main thing for this is the uptime is what makes this so good, because you essentially get at least 1 skill every single turn for +1 skill point, or 2 skill every single turn for -1 skill point, acting as a great way for the Herta as well as Tribi to gain energy, more skill points, good toughness bar breaking in tandem with his weakness implant. The additional little 20% damage per enemy also helps a little bit better for mob content, which the single target is not going to be that effective in, right? Then jumping into his ultimate, first of all, this whole sublimation state, TLDR, it doesn't actually skip your turns, but it prevents out of action turns, such as a enemy follow-up attack or an enemy counter attack, right? You can also use this to cut in between an enemy's 2 action bar, especially for boss units, usually after their first action, such as Kafka's Domination, Flame Reaver Summon, your True Swarm Summon. But most of the time you will find that, especially for our current endgame content, the extra actions generated by the boss can actually be very beneficial for you. So for example, the Flame Reaver or the True Swarm summoning the ads, the mobs, they're actually very good for the current mob content for units like the Herta. So most of the time you actually don't really want to cut in between them, or even for Kafka's Domination, if you do have a cleanse such as Huan's heal, or if you're going to be using a very high effect resistance sustain such as Gallagher, then it's essentially an extra turn, right? So essentially you don't really want to use this in between the enemy's turn unless you're facing survivability issues. For the ultimate itself, the damage is honestly quite weak, so it is much more beneficial to save the ultimate against new waves or phase changes in order to guarantee the 7 weaknesses implanted, which means that you can guarantee the extra skill after you cast your basic off skill attack, right? With how fast Anaxa cycles his ultimate due to his free skill on every single basic skill, Eagle 4P is one of the best builds for Sub-DPS Anaxa for Herta to cycle his ultimates even faster, but that's assuming only if you can hit the 200 speed effective in battle, right? This will of course give Herta even more energy interpretation stacks, which means that your Herta's damage is gonna go basically through the roof. Keep in mind that our Trace 1, it also allows Anaxa to ignore 28 defense after you cast your ultimate, so that's gonna be quite nice. Then jumping into the talent, most of this kit has been explained earlier, but to kind of sum it up, no EHR needed and essentially a permanent uptime on the weakness implants, especially with the ultimate. Now, 2 very important things to know for Anaxa is that, first of all, qualitative disclosure is only damage for Anaxa himself, not for his teammates. And the second second thing is the weakness implanted, right? The 7 different weaknesses, it does not include a res pen such as Silver. And if you take a look into the enemy mechanics in honkaistarrail, even if you have the enemy weakness, they will still have a built-in resistance to their corresponding elements, such as, for example, if you were to use your Boothill and Firefly, even though they implant weakness, it's a false weakness because the resistance for the enemy is still there. So Anaxa unfortunately does not have the res down, right? So it is basically just a way for units to access the toughness bar. Mainly, I see these usage being more prevalent, for example, in units like Apocalypse, the Shadows, right? And then lastly, technique, don't know anything about it, just use it every single time, right? That's pretty much it. And for its 3 major traces, for the first one, it gives you a 20% defense ignore, opening up a potential for maybe a 4-piece quantum with defense resources such as the signature Lightcone, or even supports like E1 Rugby. And then for its trace 2, this is essentially either a 140 crit damage buff or a team-wide 50% damage buff, not both. Even though it is a 140% crit damage increasing his base damage, this is not gonna be able to push Anaxa to the similar DPS benchmarks as compared to our version 3's main DPS so far, mainly because he is held back by his ultimate's low base multiplier despite having very fast uptime. And I would say that if Anaxa's ultimate also allowed Anaxa to fire off another free skill, that would make Hypercarry Anaxa a lot stronger, but then again, that probably would just make him completely broken, right? So it is what it is. I have tested out Hypercarry Anaxa, I'll be talking about it a little bit later, but generally speaking, only focus on the 50% damage increase for our allies. And then for the final trace, this will essentially guarantee Anaxa to get 60 energy every single turn. And this is what makes Anaxa completely skill point positive, right? You can either do a basic plus skill, or a skill plus skill, or just use a normal single basic attack or skill, which you get the 30 energy to generate the 60 energy. You will almost always use your basic every single time if damage is not a concern, but casting skills twice can and should be used, especially if you want to generate a little bit more charge stacks for 3B as well as for D Herta. For the minor traces, it's going to be 10% HP, 12% crit rate, and 22.4% wind damage. Skill leveling priority I will do for the skill, followed by talent, followed by ultimate, followed by his basic, right? And now we can jump into the discussion, which is going to be our sub-DPS Anaxa versus Hypercarry Anaxa. So I've played between multiple Memory of Chaos stages using both D Herta as well as Hypercarry Anaxa, while also trying out the differentials between Robin support or tribute support. And in order to summarize my personal experience, jumping into the sub-DPS Anaxa first, D Herta's damage increase was extremely noticeable, especially when you want to compare it to a 4-star unit like Serval or Baby Herta, right? For players that do not have Tribi, Anaxa is also going to be extremely synergistic because Robin works very well in our slot tree because Anaxa is attack scaling and his attack frequencies also helps Robin's own rotation as well. Now this is I would say this is a pretty underrated value because for the first time ever, Tribi can actually open up into your team too, and it can now give your own units such as Robin or even Sunday or even RMC to shine with a D Herta team, right? Then for your sustain slot, Gallagher or Ho-Ho, they both work. Ho-Ho can give a little bit more comfort for ultimate uptimes and spam her skill, while Anaxa mainly does his basic attack. Very good for E0 S0 D Herta players that skip Tribi as well. So if you're somebody that, you know, for example, my free-to-play account, right, he only has a E0 S0 D Herta, I can now give my Tribi to my casters, and now my D Herta can slap on Anaxa, and this team is gonna work very well, right? And I speed tune Anaxa to be faster than D Herta for some additional steps of interpretation before she actually gets a turn, but sometimes it does lead to an over excess of D Herta's energy. Me personally, I feel that having more interpretation stacks is gonna be a lot more important because it is straight up a damage multiplier increase, but you can kind of test it out and see how it feels to yourself, right? And I did run both of them on double attack boots, which is possible with either a E2 Robin or if you want to use Tribi with a Duns and Sons. So essentially just need 118 speed with Duns and Sons or 125 speed or E2 Robin. Very similar to our Facial, right? Then jumping into my experience with Hypercarry Anaxa, he somewhat feels essentially like a worse Aglaia with the exact same team of Sunday, Robin as well as Ho-Ho. Now Tribi works very well for the current endgame due to the mobs, but Anaxa ironically can't really fully utilize the targets hit by Tribi because if the number of targets does go down, it will make it such that it's only going to be a single target, so he might not generate charge as fast as what Tribi would prefer. And Robin does not really have this issue because we essentially get 100% ultimate time with Ho-Ho, as well as the fact that Robin's energy is generated from attack frequencies and not number of targets hit, right? For the speed tuning, it's going to be exactly the same as any Hypercarry Sunday setup, such as the 134 Anaxa and the 133 Sunday. Then that's pretty much it. For your personal damage in the Anaxa, I still found it to be very respectable to be clearing most of our endgame content in 2 to 3 cycles, even while being being off element because we do have the weakness implant, right? And then mainly, I would say the Hypercarry Anaxa, like I mentioned earlier, he is held back by his weak ultimate multipliers, especially if you want to compare it to a V3 DPS, such as Herta, Aglaya, Maide, or even Castris. If you want to pull Anaxa as a unit at this point, I would say that his value as a sub-DPS is far higher than if you want to pull Anaxa strictly for him to be a Hypercarry, unless you're just going to be a husband to enjoy it, right? So you are basically better off getting a actual proper V3 main DPS strictly for main DPS purposes. But if you do really want to try and play him, because me personally, I think it was very satisfying to play Anaxa into Sunny the Anaxa and just keep shooting the bullets all over again. But so to each their own, right? Looking to test some sustainer 0 cycles in the future when he comes out, so stay tuned for that next time, right? And then one more little thing I want to talk about is going to be the weakness implant. So I quickly want to say this because this is also technically a big portion of Anaxa's kit outside of the skill and ultimate spam with the skill point positivity, right? And since because Anaxa's weakness implant does not have a rest down like Silver Wolf, most of the time players will still find their best possible scenario to be using the right elemental weakness against the right enemies, right? Breaking the enemy faster with the weakness implant, it is technically a 10% final damage multiplier increase compared to a non-weakness broken enemy, on top of the added layer of comfort provided, because when the enemy is broken, they do get delayed and they don't really hit your team, right? But generally speaking, I wouldn't say that weakness break itself is going to be a game-breaking mechanic in terms of damage output. Now, the main benefit I would find with weakness implant for Anaxa is going to be in Apocalypse Shadows, because this mode is designed around breaking the enemy as fast as possible, whether you are a break DPS or not a break DPS. So for players that are struggling to match the right elements, especially for new players that don't have access to all these different DPS archetypes, Anaxa would be absolutely invaluable considering how fast he personally breaks, as well as due to his bounce toughness bar damage. I'm pretty sure that brand new players such as the free-to-play accounts, they will have a much easier time clearing Apoc Shadows compared to units that don't have Anaxa, right? So that is pretty much gonna be that. Now jumping into Anaxa's light cones, there aren't too many options besides his signature light cone or the brand new free-to-play option. So for his signature light cone, when the unit's turn start, regenerates 10 energy. If the target has a weakness implanted by the wearer, increased damage by 60% and decreases the defense by 12%, lasting up to 2 turns. Unfortunately, this cannot stack, right? So I would say this signature light cone's most important aspect is going to be the 10 energy, because notice how Anaxa gets 60 energy every single time, regardless if he does his basic or his skill because of his kit, right? And if you were to add this 10 energy, it just so perfectly matches to 70 energy times 2, which means you are guaranteed a 2-turn ultimate on Anaxa even without running an energy regeneration rope. If you do not have a signature light cone, it's gonna be relying on the enemy hits, right? So you're gonna be either at 125 energy, which means you need to get hit 2 times or you need Anaxa to get a kill, right? If you don't want to go through this RNG, then you can technically just go ahead and run an energy regeneration rope, but that does bring his personal damage down by quite a bit because you're losing 43% attack. Now note that this light cone is also very good for almost every single sub-DPS erudition units, such as, for example, if you want to run Argenti, Herta, or even Serval for all those different 4-stars or Herta, right? Because this is basically a pass key, but with the additional 12% defense reduction, with a little bit more damage for themselves personally. While this is a good light cone, the free light cone that we are going to be getting, the Great Cosmic Enterprise, is honestly an excellent free-to-play alternative, bringing up his personal damage, even though you don't really get the energy anymore. If you're okay with either taking the RNG of getting hit, or if you want to run energy regeneration rope, then you can find this very replaceable, right? So for the whales, however, the Herta Signature Light Cone is also pretty good at Anaxa, because you basically get a +1 skill point every single ultimate, and you are going to be casting your ultimate very frequently. So if you just so happen to have a spare Herta Light Cone, or if you want to play him as a Hypercarry Anaxa, you could consider slapping on Herta on himself, right? I've tried out Pass Key, but unfortunately, this additional skill that you're triggering from the follow-up, it doesn't trigger the second Pass Key effect. So unfortunately, you can't really get 12 energy times 2, right? So it still does count as a single one, but it may or may not be very crucial for specific energy breakpoints in a single cycle, because like I mentioned, you are missing essentially 15 energy for that 140 energy ultimate, right? So if you do add a Pass Key, you just only need to get hit once instead of getting hit twice. Personally, I would say this is not really worth it, because his personal damage would fall substantially, just like how if you want to run Tribute on 4-piece Ego or 4-piece Poet, it depends on on their players, right? So that's pretty much it for his Lightcone option. And then jumping into the relics, I would say that Anaxa's relics are honestly very flexible or more or less usable within their own rights. For the planar sphere, you would want to go for attack percentage. If you want to combine this with the signature icon, you basically get it up to a team-wide 150 damage buff, especially as a sub-DPS. So generally speaking, attack percentage would be a little bit more preferred. For the body, you are going to be missing quite a bit of crit rate because Anaxa, even though it's a 12% crit rate trace, most erudition DPS, they do want a little bit more on the Lightcone portion, right? And then for the rope, with signature Lightcone, you always get 70 energy per turn, so you're guaranteed a 2-turn ultimate like I mentioned earlier, or you can just go for the energy regeneration rope, which means if you don't have the signature Lightcone, you can fail this 2-turn ultimate. Sometimes, if you are gonna be able to get hit fast enough, or if you do enough bounces, you could get a 1-turn ultimate on energy regeneration rope, but that is gonna be a little bit iffy depending on the environment, right? Substats, it really depends on the final build you're going for. If you need to hit the 200 speed effective using a 4-piece ego, then you need speed. Otherwise, 134 speed with crit rate is gonna be completely fine, or just slightly faster than your Herta, right? Then for the set itself, I would say Scholar is gonna be better than Quantum or Pioneer because Scholar is gonna be the most consistent as well as easy to gear. Also, for a Scholar 4-piece, this is the most efficient domain to farm between Quantum and Ego due to Sekirot's 4-piece. And for most players who has farmed for Herta, you most likely would have probably a couple of spare scholars that's lying around, so that's gonna be that. For Quantum 4-piece, this is actually quite competitive with the defense down, since it's gonna be a guaranteed 20% defense down after a weakness implant with a built-in 28% from his tracers and an additional 12% for a Lightcone. You can essentially reach a 60% defense down, right? Finding out 40% additional defense ignores, such as your E1 Rami or E1 Lingsha, would then enable a 100% defense down, counting as the highest damage amplification in the game. Pioneer 4-piece is also decent because its weakness implants does count as separate debuffs for additional crit values in the Anaxa, right? Then if you don't really want to go for the DPS sets, the 4-piece ego is going to be the best if you want to hit the pseudo 200 speed effective. In fact, if you don't have the 4-piece ego, it's almost impossible to hit 200 speed effective, right? This is going to be quite accessible because Anaxa's ultimate is very fast, very easily doable to get 2 ultimates within a single wave, sometimes maybe even 3 ultimates if you're going to be using Robin, right? So if you want to hit a 200 speed effective with 4-piece ego, you want to hit 166.7 speed with 2 ultimates or 150 speed with 3 ultimates. If you cannot hit 200 speed effective, I would say it's kind of pointless to run 4-piece ego, and you're just better off running a Scholar or Quantum 4-piece for raw damage because action still counts the exact same unless you are taking more than 2 cycles in a single combat, right? So because 134 speed is going to be 134 speed, right? And then for a planar 2-piece, Rutilant or Izumo for damage, Luxaka or Vonwek with offensive subsets and main stat if you're looking for a little bit more buff into your Herta. I would say, strictly speaking, the highest damage value would be with your 2-piece Izumo, right? So that is pretty much how you would build Anaxa. And then jumping into the Eidolon portion, one very important thing to note for his Eidolon is that I would say for Anaxa's opportunity cost, this is the same for any unit, but especially for Anaxa because the main value with Anaxa basically ties into a vertical investment for Herta herself. In that standpoint, you could see Anaxa as sort of like a Herta Eidolon investment upgrade, if you want to think about it that way, right? You could also make a comparison that every single Anaxa's Eidolon, it could have also been a Herta Eidolon, or maybe even a Tribute Eidolon. And I would say Herta's Eidolon 1 as well as Eidolon 2, they are far more impactful in terms of total damage, or even compared to E1 Tribute, right? So with that being established, E1 Anaxa gives him 1 free skill point for the first skill, as well as 60% defense ignored for 2 turns. So this will bring Anaxa's total defense down to 76% with his signature Lightcone as well as a 4-piece Quantum. I would say it's a decent damage amplification if you stack it up, whereas the free skill point obtained from the very first skill, it is not that impactful unless you're going for a specific 0 cycle, right? And then for his Eidolon 2, when enemy targets enter the battlefield, instantly triggers 1 instance of the talent's weakness implant, reducing their all-type res by 20%. So this actually makes his weakness implant a true weakness implant like Silverwolf. It's pretty much a very straightforward 20% res down. Actually, it's even better than Silverwolf's weakness implant because it will shred the target resistance regardless if you have or have not gotten the weakness implant, right? So if you combine this with, you want to talk about damage amplification, it basically means that any team that you want to run with Anaxa, they are going to be on element because you're basically going to be applying this weakness implant plus this 20 res down for every single enemy, every single content in the game, right? right? Also, if you want to combine this with Anaxa's technique, it means that he will instantly start off with 5 weaknesses, which means that your talent can then trigger 4 qualitative disclosure, meaning your very first free skill can be activated even before you cast Anaxa's ultimate. So I would say this Eidolon 2 is pretty diabolical. And then for its Eidolon 4, increase attack by 60%. Don't have too much to say. And then finally for its Eidolon 6, a 30% multiplier damage increase for every single one of Anaxa's damage for his basic, for his skill, for his free skill, as well as his ultimate. And now you can potentially run some goofy little comps like a triple DPS or like triple support, because every single effect in the trace is going to be activated at the same time. At this point, if you are a player thinking between Eidolon 1 or Signature Lightcone, I would recommend first E0S0 as his personal vertical investments. I would feel it's not as impactful as compared to the recent V3 Eidolons that we have seen. If players really want to get Anaxa's vertical investment, I would feel that the Signature Lightcone does have more value because it is technically cheaper for a slightly lower defense down, but it guarantees a 2-turn ultimate with an attack rope, right? So that is going to be my personal recommendations. And now for the final portion about the team comps. Currently, there really is only 2 main teams that you want to use Anaxa in, the Herta as well as Anaxa Hypercarry, which I've covered earlier on. Some possible niche teams like Break Anaxa or Anaxa with J, I would want to explore them a little bit more when we get into the live server. Now, with regards to the Herta team, it's actually very flexible due to the ability to make use of Robin far better than any other HP scaling DPS as we have right now, opening our tribute for a second team. So for the Herta team comp, you're gonna run her with either tribute or Robin, with Anaxa with either Gallagher, Lingsha, or Huo. So note that for our the Herta team comp, this is gonna be very similar to, for example, Aircron with Jiao, and now Anaxa is pretty much gonna be the Herta's strongest erudition pairing due to the charge uptime, right? Between Jade and Anaxa, I can see E0 Jade's performance sliding off when the enemies become less than 3 targets in the future, and Anaxa perfectly helps us with this scenario more due to his personal bounce instead of constant reliance on AoE targets. So I'm a little bit concerned that in the future, if we see more endgame content where they want to shaft our AoE or our mob capabilities and they make it such as only 1 target or 2 targets, then Anaxa will find a lot more value compared to the current environment that we are in, right? For both Tribute and Robin, I would say that they perform very similar to one another, and I highly recommend giving Tribute to the other team, such as Castris or Maide, so that Robin can be utilized with the Herta. Now, between both, I would say as of this current point of time, Tribute does perform slightly better because the environment does favor towards the mob content, but Robin still performs exceptionally well, especially if you do have a E1 Robin from back in the days, right? Special mention to Remembrance Trailblazer. You can also use it here, but I would much rather prefer RMC to be ran with either Maide or Castris if players already have them, right? For the sustain slot, Gallagher and Lingsha are there for essentially the attack frequency as well as AoE targeting, and Lingsha is actually very comfortable here because the skill point is going to be less tight with Anaxa using so many more basic attacks, which means that you can spam a little bit more bunnies with Lingsha, right? Although Gallagher is still going to be him because, you know, he is absolutely him. For Huo specifically, the energy regeneration as well as attack buff is going to be very nice. Be sure to use Huo's skill with Shared Feelings Lightcone in order to abuse the additional skill points generated by Anaxa and granting Huo a higher ultimate uptime, right? So that is pretty much it for the Herta team comp. For the Hypercarry Anaxa team comp, there's pretty much only one single team. There's Anaxa plus Sunday plus either Tribute or Robin plus Huo. Now, this team is a lot less flexible, with Sunday and Huo being almost non-negotiable for the energy synergy, right? If you do not have Sunday, you are going to find that Anaxa can't cast its additional turns as fast as you would like to, and the additional energy provided by Sunday is going to be a lot more impactful. If you do want to use a substitute for Sunday, I would say units like Bronya or Sparkle, the good old classic action value advances, they can still work, but I would say Sunday is absolutely going to be the best in slot over here. I personally preferred Robin over E0S0 Tribute for Hypercarry Anaxa, but you need to grind a little bit of hit RNG in order to ensure that Robin gets the ultimate immediately after Anaxa takes his final action, right? So you can see from the footage over here, you are going to be opening up with a Robin skill, your Huo, and then it's going to be Anaxa, Sunday, Anaxa. After Anaxa's hit over here, most of the time you might find yourself lacking that little bit of energy for Robin unless she gets hit by the enemy in between over there, right? So if she didn't get hit, you're going to be essentially wasting an entire turn of Robin's ultimate under control state, so you definitely want to reset over there. Now, the damage output, I would say, is also not as good compared to our V3 DPS such as like Leia, since Anaxa is understandably by his nature capture a sub DPS for the Herta, right? So that's pretty much it. And with that, we have come to the end of Anaxa's early access review. I think it's a very straightforward unit, and players that are looking to get a vertical investment for the Herta, he's absolutely going to find value in your account. Otherwise, I would say if you're thinking of putting for a main DPS, we currently have characteristics, and I would say she does shine far more committed than Anaxa in terms of a main carry perspective, right? So that's pretty much it. Leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and the bro of the day is gonna be Scholar. Join Twitch, join YouTube, join Discord, join Twitter, and join Twitter. All the best for Gacha Pools. I'll see you guys next time. Take care.